Listen, we talked about steam motorcycles, which in my considered opinion were truly the very first two-wheel vehicles powered not by human muscle but rather by an external powerful force, specifically these remarkable steam motorcycles. Today we'll move on to electric motorcycles. I thought to myself that this would also be a simple idea, because after all, electricity, as I was taught in school, and probably most of you knew this to basically started with Alessandro Volta around the year 1800, who in a way discovered and invented the voltaic cell. However, when I started to look into the topic more closely, it turned out that we actually have to go back about 2000 years. In 1936, near Baghdad, a German archaeologist named Michi Koenig discovered what at first glance looked like an ordinary wine amphora, just a modest bottle, which ended up revolutionizing our thinking and knowledge about how long humanity has been using electricity. He found a bottle that was dated to around 500 BC, and inside there were no traces of wine or vinegar at all. I don't know what else they could have kept in such bottles, but there was just a rolled up sheet of copper, a piece of steel, all covered in vinegar. Actually not steel but iron, because the iron carbon alloy was probably invented a bit later, but maybe it was steel anyway. Everything was covered in vinegar and sealed with tar. The archaeologist then came up with the idea that maybe this was simply a battery, what we now call an accumulator. He was ridiculed, with people saying his theories were just fantasies, and they probably would have been forgotten if not for the fact that in the 1960s several more bottles of this type were found. What's more, it turned out that in those areas local goldsmiths had been using for who knows how long very similar devices that they made themselves. Specifically, vinegar was readily available everywhere, as were clay amphorae, tar and so on, as well as copper and steel. And what did they use them for? Well, for gilding cheaper items, that is, electroplating them with gold. At that time they probably didn't know, or rather definitely didn't know, that it was electric current, that people were making use of chemical phenomena. How did they come to the conclusion that this would work? It's hard to say. However, 500 years before our era, electricity was already used and batteries made that just didn't know they were batteries. Nevertheless, everything somehow worked, and what's more, nowadays it's very easy to repeat such an experiment. Many people repeat this, and these were actually the very first batteries built, in fact. It probably wasn't even Persia yet, but actually Mesopotamia. So in Mesopotamia, apart from galvanic activities, these sources of electricity basically weren't used for anything else, but still they were used. And we can consider this as the first, let's say, work involving electric current. In Europe, electric current was basically unknown, unless of course you count lightning, which from time to time struck someone pretty hard, but no one yet associated that with electric current, because there was no awareness that something like electric current even existed. Although of course we should mention that even the ancient Greeks and philosophers spoke about atoms, saying the world is made of atoms, but at that time they probably didn't yet know about atomic nuclei, vibrating electrons, generating current and so on. In any case, there was already some talk about atoms, but no one was able to connect it, so to speak, into any logical whole or put that knowledge into practical use. Around the year 1663, Otto von Guericke, that's how you accurately pronounce it, built a remarkable device consisting of a large sulfur sphere, and he would carefully rub this sphere and some visible sparks would jump across it. In fact, much earlier, even in ancient times, it was discovered that if you rub an amber stick with a cloth, both cloth and amber were already well known in antiquity. Some kind of electric spark jumps across. Of course, no one knew it was a spark or that it was electric, but they did notice that something strange was happening. However, that first machine built by the German researcher in 1663, can be considered the first electrostatic device. He simply rotated the spheres continuously, probably with a crank, and they became electrified with current generated from them. Of course, it was used for entertainment. I would say it wasn't really used for anything else, but in 1705 this device was improved. The sulfur sphere was replaced by a glass globe filled with mercury vapor, and inside the air was very rarefied. And now, when this globe was rubbed, if someone touched it with their hand, you could observe flashing rays inside it. This was basically the first more serious electrostatic machine. People began to wonder what could be done with it and what its purpose was. And here, let's talk for a moment about, I would say, frog legs. Because if you could give a person a slight yet noticeable electric shock with your finger, then in 1786 a certain Galvani, using this electrostatic machine, started carefully poking frog legs with wires under voltage, which, well, simply and quite remarkably contracted. He then came up with a theory of animal electricity, because at that time electricity as we know it wasn't really understood yet. However, he didn't associate it with the sphere, but rather with the idea that this energy was stored in the frog legs and that the frog legs were transferring it to the electrostatic sphere. The theory turned out to be, I would say, not entirely true, although there might have been something to it, since frog legs never really found any practical use. However, that sphere and Galvani's work in general became the inspiration for the creation of the first capacitor, the so-called Leyden jar. Admittedly, this device wasn't particularly useful for anything. Either it wasn't suitable for practical purposes, but it did provide a lot of great entertainment during various demonstrations. In the year 1745, the esteemed French priest Antoine Nollet gave a truly remarkable demonstration of this phenomenon for the reigning King of France. He lined up about 240 or 50 guardsmen, charged up the electrostatic machine really well, and connected the entire line of 240 guardsmen to the machine. It was a great source of amusement because all of them got a shock at the same time. You could say that this was the first kind of cool use of a capacitor, except that maybe it wasn't for any practical purpose, but just to make people laugh. However, in a similar year, that is in 1752, a certain Benjamin Franklin captured electricity from lightning into a Leyden jar, a capacitor, and in this way proved that lightning is actually electric current, and that basically all of this could be useful for something. These experiments also showed that it is not true that electric current comes from animal electricity, but rather is a normal physical phenomenon that also occurs in inanimate matter, which at that time was something of a novelty. However, this led to people becoming much more interested in electric current. Here, let's return to what I mentioned at the beginning, that is to Volta, Alessandro Volta, who created the first chemical cell. And basically, modern electric batteries operate on the same principle, on the same chemical process. Alessandro Volta went down in history as the creator of the first electric battery, but this was not his only discovery important for the development of the automotive industry. He was a man curious about the world, involved in various things in 1776 on the Swiss-French-Italian border. In some marshes, he collected methane in a sack, purified it a bit, and proved that with an electric spark generated from his batteries, it was possible to ignite and cause an explosion of that methane. Well, for now, this was purely theoretical work, but when you have an explosive gas and an electric spark, we are already starting to approach the era of internal combustion engines, the kind we know today, because steam engines are external combustion engines and electric ones, I would say, involve combustion in power plants. However, all those piston engines that are used in vehicles today are internal combustion engines. As for his work on natural gas, which was also used to power combustion engines, we'll talk about that on another occasion. For now, let's just note that there was already an electric battery, which for better or worse was able to store electricity. Now, however, we need to talk about the next thing, namely the electric motor. It was created by reversing the principle of another machine, the generator. In 1832, a Frenchman named Pixiat List, that's how I think it's pronounced, constructed a device that we now call a magneto-electric machine, or to put it simply, a magneto. It produced rather poor current, because permanent magnets aren't particularly well suited for this purpose. However, a breakthrough in the production of electricity and, in general, in the further development of motors was the invention of the dynamo electric generator, or what we call a dynamo, by a certain Siemens in 1866. A device of this kind, in its simplest form, can still be found on bicycles today. Here, the magnetic field is generated by electromagnets, which are powered by the very electricity that the device itself produces. So you simply need to turn something for the device to work, just as I mentioned before, like on bicycles. However, since steam engines already existed, since there was something that could provide rotational motion, meaning a device capable of turning them, logically, it was only a matter of time before devices like generators, power plants, and so on inevitably came into being. The first one was in, I think, 1831. He connected a battery, a completely different kind, a Volta-type battery, with an electric motor and sailed a boat on the river, powering the boat with this device he had built. So you could say that around 1830, the first electric motors appeared, maybe not perfect, but they worked. However, in 1831, Faraday's disc was basically a poorly functioning electric motor. However, when the commutators appeared, which were invented and discovered as, well, brushes, I would say, transmitting the current in 1837, the American Davenport harnessed an electric motor to a machine tool. It's hard to say what exactly he was machining there, whether it was metal or wood. In any case, the first electric device with an electric motor was already operating in 1837, and by 1881 electric trams were already running in Berlin. Namely, there were generators, there were motors, there was a steam engine, and so when all of this was put together, it simply resulted in the normal operation of electric current. It was also inevitable that someone would try to fit an electric motor into vehicles, cars and motorcycles, and here I have to, well, maybe not say disappoint you, but perhaps surprise you a bit, that the very first and fastest vehicles and the most efficient in human history were actually electric cars. In I believe 1898, the speed record for a car was broken, and it was about 102 kilometers per hour, and of course it was electric, because combustion engines were simply not suitable for that at all. Apparently the first one, though, these are just some reports, as there isn't much documentation on this topic. Supposedly the first electric motorcycle was built in Scotland by a certain Robert Anderson, and in the USA by Davenport. In 1835, apparently there were some electric vehicles in operation, but I would say no serious documentation about this has survived. However, the development of electric vehicles was greatly advanced by the invention of the lead-acid battery, which we basically know in almost unchanged form to this day, and also the commutator motor. The first such vehicle ran in, I believe, 1869, and was based precisely on this type of battery and a commutator motor. It didn't go very fast, up to about 15 kilometers per hour. It had a range of 45 kilometers. By the way, that's not much less than modern electric vehicles. The only thing is, back then the battery weighed almost 50 kilograms, and like I said, it went 15 kilometers per hour. In this respect though, there has been significant progress up to the present day. Anyway, by the end of the 19th century, electric vehicles were already driving around many European capitals: Berlin, Moscow, Paris, as well as New York, while combustion engine vehicles could be said to have still been in their larval stage. However, when, the lobby, so to speak, the oil lobby got itself a bit more organized. So basically by the end of the 19th century there were a lot of electric vehicles on the roads, but by 1910 or 1915 they were almost gone. All these vehicles had one fundamental flaw, which by the way they still have today, namely range. As we know, you can't really squeeze that much electricity out of a battery, and what was a problem for electric vehicles in the 19th century is basically still a problem today. In this regard, unfortunately, not much has changed here. However, the first historically moving electric motorcycle, or rather not moving, but the first presented electric vehicle, was a patent introduced in 1869 in France. Joseph Marie, I believe that was his name, presented such a theoretical work. There were drawings, some of which have survived to this day. He submitted it to the patent office. However, it seems that this vehicle was never, so to speak, brought even to the prototype stage, meaning it never became a functioning, drivable model. However, the first electric vehicle that definitely drove was the three-wheeler by Gustave Trouvé, which was demonstrated in Paris on the 19th of April 1881, and which, for better or worse, was able to run. On the other hand, electric motorcycles found even less acceptance among consumers than electric cars, and basically no one was particularly interested in them. As I would say, the idea of electric motorcycles died out, certainly around the years 1910 to 1915, although that's not entirely true, because while digging through the vast depths of the internet, I found a British company that produced electric motorcycles from around 1920 to 1942, and those were definitely electric motorcycles. However, it was already such a niche matter that, hardly anyone was really interested in it. It wasn't until the 21st century, with the rise of the electric lobby and the world's dwindling oil supplies, that people were forced to look for alternative sources of vehicle propulsion. And so electric vehicles, which had been forgotten for many decades, were revisited. And of course these vehicles also have their drawbacks, and I truly think that until we are able to invent some kind of incredibly tiny microscopic atomic reactor, perhaps even the size of let's say a standard cigarette box, electric vehicles will undoubtedly continue to be very much with us, despite all their various inherent flaws and limitations, right? I think we'll end our story about electric vehicles here, because this was supposed to be about the history of motorcycling, not about the modern era of motorcycling. So we've wrapped up the section on historic electric motorcycles with the rather sad conclusion that not much has improved when it comes to range.